Welcome to Intentional Conversations. We are so glad to have all of you here joining us on this Friday, June 24th. As you are entering the conversation, if you would, center us all by adding where you're joining us from in the chat. It's always great to see where our wide podcast community is joining us from and how we span across not only the US, but even internationally. Awesome. So we have Omaha, Nebraska. We have South Carolina. Our colleague Rachel joining us from Los Angeles. Of course, Michael in Amsterdam. We have Virginia Beach, Denver. This is beautiful. We're super excited. And as always, love to see all of you as we get ready to launch into this week's Intentional Conversation. So Intentional Conversations, of course, is intersecting DEI, leadership, and business. And while we love doing this with our podcast community every Friday right here live via Zoom and posting that, of course, to be watched on our YouTube channel, we are also now providing IC in a podcast format. So if you love to listen while you're driving, or you really feel like you can connect while you're working and just having something going in your ear, I know that's really, really helpful for me. Feel free to tune in to our podcast, and you can listen to all of our previous and upcoming intentional conversations on all streaming platforms. And of course, we are still continuing to celebrate Pride Month. And as June is coming to an end, we do just want to reiterate that while we love celebrating and amplifying the voices of our LGBTQ plus community in the month of June, this is work that we will continue as we push for acceptance and just extending grace and love to all. And that's something that we need to do 365 days of the year for forever. So coming up next week, we have Yolanda Brown, and she will be joining the conversation to talk about the intersectionality of mentoring and diversity, equity, and inclusion. So make sure that you all are tuned in next Friday, July 1st. And then on July 8th, we're super excited to invite Vince Pearson to join us to discuss the intersection of sports and social justice and how this relates to the work DEI practitioners are doing and the power of sports to impact society. And today we are excited to welcome Leah Smiley, who will be joining us to talk about, who'll be joining us to talk about unpack some really great things within this space. And Leah is the founder and president of the Society for Diversity, Inc., and is on LinkedIn as an all-star. Mrs. Smiley has facilitated hundreds of presentations for more than 10,000 professionals and executives around the world, as well as consulted with more than 100 organizations. Prior to founding the Society for Diversity, Mrs. Smiley spent a decade in the healthcare industry working for Cigna Corp., the City of Philadelphia Health Department, and CGI Consulting Group, which is now Willis Towers Watson. With 18 years of experience exclusively in DE&I, as well as 30 years as a Master of Training in Organizational Development, Mrs. Smiley is considered to be a DE&I thought leader. Smiley's work has been featured on international and national radio and television programs, as well as in USA Today, Huffington Post, Business Insurance, the Indianapolis Star, the Indianapolis Business Journal, Indiana Minority Business Magazine, Associations Now, Franchising World Magazine, MEA Magazine, the Lexington Herald Leader, the Philadelphia Tribune, the Philadelphia Business Journal, Naples Daily News, the City Sentinel, Lee and Low Books, and many more. She was also quoted in The Inclusion Revolution is Now, an innovative framework for diversity and inclusion in the workplace by Mara G. Robinson and published by iUniverse. So while I love to read and just go over just the expertise that our co-hosts bring to this space, I also love to lean into maybe something that we would not find from your bio. So Leah, I would love to turn it over to you to tell us something that may be a fun fact or just something unique that we would not find about you on the web or just from your biography.
One of the biggest things is that I am a sports mom. So I have two kids that are in basketball, and surprisingly, both of my kids are doing basketball, I'll say 6 or 7 days a week. So I'm literally working all day. And then in the evenings, I am going from school to school doing basketball. So for those of you who are parents of kids in sports, you know the summer basketball, the summer leagues, and what people are doing in the summer and for the school. And literally last week alone, I did 18 games. This week, this week I am not doing as many games. I think I only did 12. I'm missing a day today, so I won't do as many games this week. But I will have basketball all day tomorrow. So I am a 100% fully committed basketball mom, and it literally takes all of my time, 6 to 7 days a week, all throughout the year.
Yes, Leah, growing up, my brother was in basketball, and every summer we traveled AAU, going to the games. I mean, our whole lives, I feel like, kind of revolved around that schedule. And so I completely understand the intensity, but also it was something that, looking back, I really did enjoy. It was a lot of fun. So awesome. Well, I'm going to open it up to Rachel to kind of start us out today with our IC session.
Well, hello, everyone. Good morning. Leah Smiley, just reading her bio, listening to her bio, she is a powerhouse. She is a diversity, equity, and inclusion powerhouse. And I'm just going to let everybody know that I got certified through her organization. She has a certification program where you can become a certified diversity expert through her organization. And so did Nika White. So look up Leah after this. There's definitely a powerhouse. She's definitely a powerhouse. And with you being a powerhouse, Leah, you have 10 ways that DEI is changing. How did you discover the 10? And can you describe them to us?
Yeah, so one of the things that I do normally is I spend at least, in addition to basketball, I spend at least 2 hours a day reading. Every day. That I do 7 days a week. But in all of the information that I have been reading, I've been taking note about how this field is changing, in addition to talking to DEI leaders through our certification program. And one of the things that I'm going to cover is just how this field is continuing to evolve. So if you think about it, in the 1980s, we saw the creation of the chief technology officer. And during that time, there were companies that were like, we don't need a chief technology officer. You think fast forward 2022, that role is so solid that you would never imagine a big organization not having a chief technology officer, right? When COVID first hit, the Washington Post reported that diversity and inclusion jobs fell by 60%. So a lot of organizations took that as an opportunity to say, hey, we're going to lay off workers. We're going to make it so that we get rid of this thing that we've been wanting to get rid of all the time. Now is the time, right? But you don't hear that same sentiment today as we hear the economy slowing. And not only did George Floyd play a role in that, but I was listening to a webinar last night while I was at a game. I was listening to a webinar on Black Enterprise Magazine that they held. And one of the things that they said is that we're not going to see organizations going back and saying, hey, let's get rid of that diversity and inclusion job. We're not going to do this anymore because it's not something that we need. Companies realize that this role is necessary. And as more and more organizations continue to hire and continue to build this role out, it is necessary for us to understand how our role is different. It's not like the 1960s or the 1980s or the early 2000s. We're in 2022, and we need to prepare for 2025, 2030, so that we're not discussing the same stuff that we've been discussing for the last 10 to 15 years. LinkedIn and Indeed both report that the D&I role globally has grown significantly over the last 3 years. It's one of the top, 10 fields, and that's in 3 years. So we're going to continue to see growth in this role, but from a strategic perspective, we have to be clear about what our priorities are.
Thank you. So you said 16% of
60.
60%.
60. The Washington Post reported that 60% of DEI jobs were cut after COVID. And then George Floyd happened, and all those same companies went back and said, oh, shoot, we really do need to have a DEI person.
And so with the pandemic and with a lot of organizations having to pivot and be agile and go to the hybrid workforce, do you think that was one of the reasons why all of a sudden there was a focus back on DEI jobs?
Well, it's a combination of things. Those things are important, but we've also seen a shift in what we'll call the beans, behaviors, expectations, attitudes, and needs, where folks, have said through the Great Resignation, we don't want to work for a company that has an awful culture, a toxic culture, right? So that has been a factor. You also have the employees that are protesting and walking out. And usually when they stage these walkouts, diversity, equity, and inclusion is one of the reasons why they're walking out, right? You also have these demographics, right? So in 2020, countries around the world did their census count, right? And here in the US, the census count was wrong, but certainly, and that's because they undercounted all of some of the growing groups, right? So they undercounted Hispanics, they undercounted Blacks, they undercounted Asians, and certainly that is a challenge as we're talking here. But one of the reasons why these groups were undercounted is because of their significant presence here in this country. So you cannot ignore the fact that these groups represent a huge proportion, not only of the country, but of the buying power in the economy. And any organization that's disconnected from not only their needs, but how their needs may overlap through what we'll call intersectionality, is ultimately going to be a company that is disconnected from their key group, right? So, and certainly people are becoming more comfortable and vocal with and saying, hey, we need diversity, right? So that's not just employees, it's not just customers, but it's also coming from the board. Those board members, those investors, they're looking for high performing organizations. And there's data out there that has been around for decades that suggests that diverse organizations managed well perform better over time.
Wow, yes. Thank you, Leah. That is very eye-opening, that statistic around after COVID. And it leads me to ask, how has what falls under DEI now expanded? What does that look like now?
So let's take a little walk through history. When DEI was kind of formulated through Title VII, and really you saw the creation of EEO, Equal Employment Opportunity Roles, right? And from there, we saw roles being created for diversity, because organizations said, hey, we don't want to just focus on compliance only, right? We need to do something more. So from there, we saw the creation of diversity roles. And those diversity roles, for the most part, were housed under the office of, sorry, that's coming from my house, that noise. Can you do that later? Okay. So, so one of the things that we saw was that those diversity roles were housed under human resources. And thank you. Those DEI roles were housed under human resources. And as we begin to see the role evolving, people say, well, wait a minute, HR is saying, hey, there's some things we don't want our DEI person to do, right? We don't want our DEI person dibbling and dabbling in marketing. We don't want our DEI person dibbling and dabbling in the supply chain. We don't want our diversity person dibbling and dabbling with the board, right? The HR person is supposed to do the board presentations. So a lot of organizations said, but we need to have someone in diversity who's fulfilling these roles. So then a lot of organizations began creating a separate role for DEI outside of human resources. Now, there are some organizations that still house their diversity role under HR. But again, that's going back to the stage that the organization is in their diversity, equity, and inclusion journey. Because the best place for the DEI role is an independent office reporting directly to the CEO, not buried down the food chain 4 and 5 levels, right? Not reporting to the chief human resources officer, who reports to the chief operating officer, who reports to, someone else, but making it so that there's a direct connection to the CEO or president. And making it so that as we're talking about this, the role now is in this different place where there are more expectations for results, right? And more expectations for integration throughout the entire organization. So no longer is there an expectation that the DEI person is going to just operate by themselves in this one place. Now we want people to have operations and to have product development and all sorts of different things. And I'll just use an example here. Everyone knows that when you go online and you do things like you go online and you're doing something that's secure. CAPTCHA, remember you had to choose like the blocks that would or choose something, choose all the places where there's a crosswalk, or choose where there, do these letters or do something, right? And now you have companies like Apple that are coming out and saying CAPTCHA is not inclusive, so we're going to stop using them. And the way that it was not inclusive is that people with visual impairments had a hard time using CAPTCHA, and people who were not based here in the US also had a hard time figuring out, now what do they mean when they say choose the motorcycle, or choose the motorhome, or choose the bus, right? Because in different countries, you call things different words. So from the perspective of inclusion, the CAPTCHA exercises were not that inclusive. So from a design perspective, the expectation is that organizations will really be inclusive in how, yes, thank you, Rachel, for that. From a design perspective, the expectation is that you will have an understanding of diversity and inclusion and what that really means in your product development. Not just thinking about it in terms of, we got to we got to recruit employees and train employees, but how does it translate into better business outcomes, right? So that organizations who develop products like the CAPTCHA are not disrupted.
So basically, the diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioners are dibbling and dabbling in everything that you said people were saying we shouldn't be.
Right.
So with that said, how do DEI practitioners strategically address the next 5 years of change? Because just from what you've described, this whole diversity, equity, and inclusion was boxed into, this is what it is, this is what you do. And now people are beginning to realize that there's more to DEI. So as a practitioner, how do I strategically address change looking forward into the next 5 years?
So the earliest indicator of where change will occur is in the household. And if you don't have kids or grandkids in the household, go to the schools. So one of the things that people saw in the George Floyd protests was that you had a variety of different people who were at those protests. And that is so different than previous protests in previous years, right? And certainly a lot of organizations were surprised that that they had so many people who were, just involved in those protests. But it was an indicator that this diversity, equity, and inclusion stuff is interesting to everybody, right? And it's not just something that affects Black people. It's not just something that affects women. It's not just something that affects people who are LGBTQ. It affects everybody. And if you have places in the organization that are toxic, it also impacts everybody. So I don't know if anyone has heard of the Activision Blizzard controversy and all that has happened there. So again, this is another way that DEI work is changing. So earlier this year, Microsoft announced that they were going to acquire Activision Blizzard. And this is a huge acquisition. But one of the things that they found in their due diligence is that the culture at Activision Blizzard was bad. I mean, very, very bad. It was so bad that they had an employee commit suicide from the sexual harassment. And this is a multi-million-dollar settlement with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. It is a huge thing, right? But who would have thought 15 years ago that DEI and organizational culture would have been one of the things that Microsoft, a big, multinational organization, would consider in an acquisition deal? Who would have thought that 15 years ago? Culture would be one of the big things that's a part of this acquisition deal. No one would have ever thought. And the fact that Microsoft made conditions that Activision Blizzard had to deal with these things, and Activision Blizzard fired like 60 folks. They fired managers, they fired all these different people for being involved specifically in this harassment this gender, this exclusion, this discrimination, this toxic culture. They fired those folks, and there was a multi-million-dollar settlement, not only with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, but also they have been working with the state of California, and certainly we would have never thought that this would be a part of the framework. But as we're looking to the future, this is going to be one of the areas where DEI leaders are involved in that due diligence process, and making it so that as we see all of this merger and acquisition activity, we're going to also have to be fluent in those processes, right? Because when that issue comes up, we have to be prepared. And we also have to know what to do when there are, when there's more than one office of diversity involved. Which office should take over, right? The one that is barely developed, or the one that is already developed. So I have heard lots of stories. I've heard stories where the one that's barely developed took over, and folks started jumping ship. They were like, I got to get out of here, because these folks are taking us back to the 1980s. And then I've heard stories where, we had one person who was a CDP, and the company was acquired because of their advanced diversity efforts. And certainly one of the things that happened was that, she wound up saying, well, I got to start all over. I built everything up, and now we're being acquired, and I have to start all over from the ground up. Oh my goodness. So she wound up leaving. But certainly, I think you all missed the point that I said. The company was acquired because of the advanced diversity efforts. I mean, again, we are entering into a new era. And certainly, as we're talking about this new era, we've got to be, prepared for what the future holds. So not only looking at us playing a bigger role in key business decisions, but also us, being on the forefront of that product development, making it so that we can get our resource groups involved in those decisions. When it comes to things like bias and artificial intelligence and algorithmic bias, and that impacts everything from, whether or not someone gets a loan, to whether or not someone gets called back for a job, to whether or not, you can go to the bathroom and wash your hands, right? So all of these things, especially when we're talking about vehicles and automobiles and them being able to sense people and not being able to sense people of color, right? So as we're talking about self-driving vehicles and all sorts of other technology, all of these things have to be, considered.
I told you, Leah comes with facts. She always drops the knowledge. It's not just, this is what's happening in the DEI world. She has real live world experiences and examples. So thank you for that. So Leah, as DEI changes and evolves, how can practitioners remain up to date? Like you, I go to your LinkedIn to get my updates because I know you're current, but we're so busy with our day-to-day jobs. How do we remain up to date? How do we remain relevant to ensure continual growth? Because there's so much coming at us all at one time, competing priorities. How do you do it so well? And I'm thinking even this morning we logged on and it's like Roe versus Wade, right?
Yeah.
How do you keep up? The gun laws, so many things going on. So how as practitioners do we remain up to date?
That is such a good question. So again, I'm going to use another example as to why we do need to stay up to date. So I'm going back to, some of the bigger organizations that have been doing diversity for many, many years, 50 years, 60 years, so on. One of the challenges that comes along with doing diversity for a long period of time is that sometimes we can become comfortable. Like, okay, we're advanced. We're doing some things that no one else is doing. This is certainly advanced, and we're, at the forefront of diversity. Now, with all the changes that you just talked about, COVID, George Floyd, Roe v. Wade being overturned, all these things, what was advanced 2 years ago is now outdated. Because sometimes things change at the drop of a dime, and we as DEI leaders have to stay on top of what is changing and how it relates to the work that we're doing. So one of the ways that we're going to stay on top of things is making sure that we're connected to people in our industry. Not just connecting with, so back in the day, like when you used to work in this field, and you got to a certain level, you're the chief diversity officer, you're the senior vice president, you kind of connect with people in this industry who are, on that same level, and you stay on that level. You don't, connect with someone who's only, just entering into this field. But it's necessary for us to connect with some of the newer people who are entering into the field. Because again, going back to what I said earlier, they have a different idea about diversity than the folks who have been doing it for, yes, that whole generational intelligence. They have a different idea about diversity, equity, and inclusion than we did, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And they are much more progressive. So what that means is if you were doing diversity like people did it 10 years ago, 20 years ago, today you are outdated and behind if you haven't continued to evolve. So you're going to need to not only connect with people who are on your level, you're going to need to connect with people who are in the industry as a whole, because so many things have happened over time that have made what was happening, 10 years ago outdated. And every time I think, okay, well, I'm up on top of things. My kids remind me, like my daughter, she always, I'll say accidentally, she calls me a boomer. Okay, boomer. I'm like, hey, I'm not a boomer. But that's just a reminder to me that I need to do more to stay on top of what's going on, right? And certainly connecting with the younger generation of people who are doing this work is one area. But two, taking the time to read, and not just read the things that you're comfortable with reading the stuff that's in opposition to, like reading what Fox News is saying, right? So I read 2 hours a day, sometimes more, and you got to know what they're saying on Fox News. I know you don't like it. I know it's frustrating, but you got to know what they're saying, because if you don't, you're going to be in the position where you're not going to know how to respond to stuff. So I give an example of, I was talking this morning before we got started, I used the example of Disney and the whole "don't say gay" controversy, and how Disney initially did not respond to the legislation that was being proposed. They let it get passed in a law, and then they came out and they took a stance and said, hey, we're opposed to this, we're going to stand against it. And then all of a sudden the politicians said, yes, we're going to take away your special tax treatment. And people began to support it, like, yeah, go ahead, take away their special tax treatment. And what began to happen is that Disney didn't know how to respond. They weren't prepared. And as DEI leaders, we have to prepare our executives for that controversy. We got to give them speaking notes. We have to make it so that we alert them and say, hey, let's not just think that everybody's going to be supportive of this. Let's also talk about the folks that are not supportive of it and how we need to respond to them. Let's dispel some of this misinformation that's out there. The same thing happened with the critical race theory. So after George Floyd happened and everybody starts transitioning and pivoting, and one of the things that we started doing was really talking more about critical race theory. And then all of a sudden, boom, we get hit. You have people fighting at school board meetings. You have laws being passed where these politicians are saying, you can't talk about critical race theory and all this. And we just had silence. We didn't know what to say, even when that misinformation was being circulated. And it's important for us that we know what to say, how to respond. And that's why we need to know what's going on. We need to not just read those sources that are familiar to us and that we, love. We're not just seeking confirmation bias, right? We are seeking to step outside and know what the critics are saying so that we can prepare those talking points for our executives. They need to know what to say. The third thing is that there are a lot of best practices out there, and there is a trove of research that shows what gets good results. So why are we still experimenting and reinventing the wheel and Google searching stuff when we already know that there is research out there to suggest here is what works and here is what gets great results?
I love that, Leah. That is, I'm just processing and digesting everything you've just said. And it really is important to lean into those different conversations so that you're looking at things from all perspectives, which can be challenging, as you named, but it's very important so that you do know how to step into and to kind of like mitigate those conversations when you're talking with others. So I'd like to ask one more question. We're going to kind of pivot just a little bit right before we open up questions to the audience. But I would love for you to tell us more about the Institute for Diversity Certification, what it is, why it's important.
So the Institute for Diversity Certification has been conferring certified diversity professional and certified diversity executive credentials since 2009. And we have developed a very effective system to help prepare leaders for the future of this DEI work, and making it so that we're not just looking at developing check the box initiatives, but we're creating holistic solutions that will deliver great outcomes. In essence, the Institute for Diversity Certification, or IDC, focuses on effectiveness. And we evaluate whether or not we are effective by, how our leaders do. If someone has CDP or CDE credentials, what's happening with them? We want to know. We want to know if they're getting promotions, if they are getting bigger budgets, if they are making an impact, but specifically, how are their organizations doing? Each year we give awards away through our annual conference. And one of the things that we did last year that was pretty interesting, we do this every year, but last year in particular was very interesting in that the committee, they selected who gets the awards based on the advancements that the organizations have made. And we didn't tell the committee members this, but certainly everyone who was selected for an award had multiple people. Every organization had multiple people that they sent through the certification program, and they made the most progress. And it is for us, it was no surprise that the organizations that had the most progress had the most educated through certification. They had the most educated leaders in place who were thinking strategically about the work that they're doing. The certification program is competency based. So a lot of people are like, oh yeah, well, how hard can diversity, equity, and inclusion certification be? I mean, this is just a piece of cake. No, it's a rigorous process. And we work with universities to help design the process. And we also make it so that we follow the best practices that have been established through the Institute for Credentialing Excellence. So just like taking like a bar exam or the SPHR, PHR certification, or a technology certification, getting a teaching license, all those different things. Our exam is rigorous in the same way. There are a lot of people who want to get their, they want to go quickly through a program. They want quick results. And certainly I'm okay, with, the folks that want to do this quickly. But certainly they may not be the best candidates for certification, because certification looks at helping you to get results. And taking a one-time class may not get you, it may get you something, but it may not get you the results that are worth reading about. And certainly I tell people in the program, I don't want to read about you in a bad way, right? So some people tell me stories, they're like, oh yeah, well there was a CDP that went through a program and they just made a mess at that organization. I'm like, okay, so first of all, what organization did they get their credentials from? And they're like, so and so. Yeah, that's the problem. That's number one. But number two, they shouldn't even have CDP or CDE after the name, because we own the trademarks. Okay, so yeah, if somebody created a mess somewhere, it wasn't one of our people. I tell them, hey, look, we have a perfect record. Since 2009, we've had thousands of folks that have gone through our program, and we make it so that we don't want to read about you in a bad way. Okay, we need to read about the wonderful things that you're doing, right? So we focus more on what I'll call leadership development, where we want you to be recognized as leaders in this industry, as well as in your own fields.
And like I said, Dr. Nika White and myself, we went through the program, and the test, she's not lying. Dr. White had to do it twice, and me too. Like, you think you're prepared and you study and you think you know everything. Yeah, what are the protected classes? I know this, and you go in and it's like, wow. So she's telling the truth. I highly recommend the program for people who want to have a certification behind your name to say that, you understand diversity, equity, and inclusion work. So Leah, one thing that amazes me about you is you are always even keel. You never get fazed by anything. Like, things could be going on from the different sides, and you always maintain just that even keel, and you always present facts, always facts. So Rebecca put in chat, do you have any advice for protecting your mental health while staying informed on opposing viewpoints? How can we be cool, calm, and collected like you, Leah, at all times?
So that's such a good question. One of the things that I would recommend is that you have to stay centered. And you have to know, because one of the things that happens in this field is that you can experience burnout. And I've been doing this work for a lot of years, and I can tell you that burnout is real. So one of the things that you want to do is make it so that you're aware of your own mental health. Like they tell you on the airplane, like, make sure, and I tell my kids this all the time, make sure you put your own mask on before you attempt to help somebody else put their mask on. So we can't be people that are out there trying to save the world. And we are not saving ourselves. And that means also saving yourselves from the negativity that's out there, because we can become negative too and pessimistic. And there's a whole bunch of DEI people that are negative and pessimistic. Oh, nothing's going to change. I don't need to be around you, because things are changing. And I am going to make sure that I do my part to make that change. Right. And making it so that we're not just taking in all of that negative information and becoming, the opposite of what we actually say we want. Like, saying, oh yeah, well, I hate when people are biased and discriminatory and filled with hate. But yet I don't like those conservatives. I don't like those Republicans. I don't like those Trump supporters. Well, we're becoming, that's becoming what we say that we don't want to be. And then the other challenge is the trauma that comes along with always fighting. So you've got to do strategies instead of you fighting everybody. You've got to do strategies that equip other folks to fight on your behalf. Because if you do all the fighting, you're going to get burnt out. What you're going to have to do is, instead of waiting until you get to the meeting and then you're like, oh man, they just got in there and they started going in on me, and the supervisor, she turned to me and said, Leah would like to add something. Leah, what would you like to bring up? And then I have to bring up the hard stuff and I'm mad at the supervisor. No, you're going into the meeting, right? So do the meeting before the meeting. Do the back room deal before you get into the meeting. So, you may not have someone who can speak on all areas of diversity, but they are fired up about immigration. They are fired up about LGBTQ. They are fired up about whatever it is. Get them to speak on those things. So when it comes to the meeting, you got to do this one-on-one though. You got to take the time to get those allies on your side before the meeting. When you get to the meeting, you have other people who are dropping those bombs, right? So that you're not the only one dropping bombs. You got to be strategic about this. And then you also have to make it so that you are, again, preparing those senior leaders with those talking points. So a lot of what we do is reactive. We get called into the office and we're told, oh yeah, well, we don't want you to do this anymore. Well, that's because someone complained about what we're doing. And instead of waiting until somebody complains about what we're doing, let's be proactive and give those executives talking points. Here's what you say when somebody complains. Keep it simple. Right? From a rest and relaxation perspective, I am a Christian, so I make sure that I read, I pray, doing all those different things before I start my day off. But if you're not a Christian, if you're a Muslim, if you're someone who is a non-religious person, if you are, a Hindu, whatever you are, taking the time to center yourself before you get that day started. Because again, we're dealing with a lot of stuff, other people's baggage. And we have to be mindful that other people's baggage can hurt us and cause trauma to us if we don't unload that stuff. So you've got to be able to take that time off to refresh. So I always like to say that my kids' basketball is my dirty little secret. Nobody knows that I'm doing it. And certainly that's how I get to unload. And I enjoy going to those games and those marathon games. And you've got to also find that thing outside of your work that you love to do and making the time to do it, whether it's exercising, whether it's spending time with your kids, whether it's spending time with your grandkids, spending time with your dog or your pet, making it so that you get outside and enjoy the fresh air. You've got to make sure that you take that time to refresh. Because and even taking those vacations and not doing anything, right? Not doing any work, disconnecting, because then you can get yourself fired up again to get back in there and make a difference, right? But you got to take that time for you. You are the most important factor in this equation. And if you are not healthy mentally, then everything else falls apart.
Thank you, Leah. This has been so amazing. And I amplify, Tracy left in the chat that this has been some of the most practical and helpful advice that she's heard in a long time. And I think that this has just been so spot on. And I can continue to tap into this well of knowledge. But I do want to offer an opportunity for the Vodcast community to ask any questions. If you would like to use the raise hand reaction, we can definitely spotlight you and have you unmute yourself to ask your question out loud, or drop in the chat. We only have about 8 more minutes, so I am happy to move forward with another question of my own, but would love to just give a few seconds for the audience to chime in if they have any questions they would like to ask.
Courtney, so Aaron, I don't know if you would like to unmute yourself and ask Leah your question.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for the information. I've enjoyed the webinar. I'm new kind of to my DEI journey, but definitely interested in the certification. And my question was, beyond doing the online courses that are on the website, is there anything else I can do at this point to start to prepare for the certification?
Not really. We will provide you with everything you need. There's a study guide that you'll get. It's 350 pages. And then once you get that study guide, just reading it, and you'll have access to an online learning management system where you can connect with DEI leaders from 30 countries around the world. And you can just start thinking about the application portion. Like one of the things that we ask people when they are interested in the program is, what are your goals? Where do you want your career to go, right? And you being very clear about your path and where this is heading, so that you're not just kind of jumping into this field because it's hot, but really thinking about your purpose professionally, but also personally.
Aaron, I can say I ask the same questions because I like to be over-prepared. You literally just have to show up. And it is a rigorous program. You also have to submit, a thesis as well. I call it a thesis. So it's an intense program, but you come out on the other end knowing that you're qualified to show up in any workspace and say that you're a diversity expert.
Yeah, we definitely want to make sure that when you go out for a position, that you not only have the knowledge, but you have the skill to do the work.
Leah, you have something called beans. Could you tell us about beans?
So beans are the behaviors, expectations, attitudes, and needs that are changing. And to tie that into the whole conversation about Roe v. Wade, the needs of women will change in your workplace. And what that means is that there will be some people who will be impacted by children, perhaps if they have to have children. There may be some people who are impacted by those children because they're traumatized due to rape or some other issue or some health issue that they're dealing with as a result of being forced to have a child. They may have challenges with childcare. We will also see that there will be challenges relating to insurance, and people who don't have insurance, especially in those states where they have really restrictive abortion laws, and they have those requirements. Those are the same states that cut Medicaid for young children. So there will be folks who were looking around saying, you know what, how are we going to provide for these children, knowing that the cost of childcare is expensive, knowing that every employer does not provide insurance, knowing that I may not be able to get Medicaid in my state, knowing that all these different things will impact me. So employers are going to have to be strategic in dealing with changing behaviors, expectations, attitudes, and needs, especially so that it won't impact their workforce. It won't impact their representation, especially in industries where women tend to be underrepresented, so that it doesn't impact things like equal pay and people being able to reintegrate into the workforce after taking time off to raise a child. So again, these are all things that we struggle with anyway, but certainly having these conversations so that we're not at a disadvantage in the next 5, 10, 15 years.
So you're saying as DEI practitioners, we should have the beans approach to how we do and implement our DEI strategies.
Right. Knowing what laws are changing and being able to develop a plan, a strategy that will respond accordingly. Not just saying, hey, we're going to bus people across state lines, but also being aware that busing someone across state lines may require, time off, right? It may require, and God forbid something happened to someone health-wise, these are all challenges that organizations will have to be prepared for with their workforce.
Yeah, no, and I think tying that in with what's currently going on just as early as today with this Roe v. Wade is just a great way to really illustrate the importance of that, because all of the different things you were naming were things that now that you said them, I'm like, duh, but that you may not have originally thought when assessing the situation and just the totality of what it means for women and their rights and how this can just really greatly impact their lives. So thank you so much for bringing that to this conversation. We only have a couple of minutes, so I would love for you to maybe leave us with some final thoughts, closing remarks to kind of close us out. You have been such a wealth of knowledge, and we have just greatly appreciate you sharing with us today.
Okay, good. So I just want everyone to kind of walk away with the fact that this field is changing. We need to stay on top of what's changing so that we can be intentional and strategic and proactive about all the changes that we see going on, that we take the time to ask the right questions, get the right people on our team, and make it so that we are not disconnected from the future of this field and what this work will require.
100%. Well, thank you so much, Leah. Thank you all for joining us today. We hope that you have a beautiful, beautiful weekend, and we look forward to seeing all of you next week. Be well.
All right. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.